There it goes. Awesome. Okay, so I just want to thank you for taking the time to, do this video chat with me for my class. Um, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I'll just ask a couple of questions. You could take your time with answering. And yeah, so my name is Sandy. As I told you before, I am a student here at California State University, Monterey Bay, and I'm taking the class in journalism
Mm-hmm.
and media around the world. So yeah, I'm just reaching out to you for a project for that class where we get to interview different journalists from across the world and things like that. Um, so my first question for you is, how did you first get interested in journalism, and how did you know you wanted to pursue journalism? Remember reading that you first started journalism when you were an assistant producer for some documentary projects. So I just want to know more about that.
Yeah, so I was when I was in university. So my degree was in film, but I went in through like the school that I went to. You could either go in through visual arts or go in through communications. So I was a communications student, and I was planning to take film from the beginning, but when I was doing the different modules for communications, journalism also seemed very interesting. But I kind of hadn't thought of it very much. I was like, oh yeah, journalism would be interesting, but then still went into film and did a lot of like video production stuff.
Mhm.
And so I hadn't given it that much thought until I graduated and I went back to Singapore. So I was studying in New Zealand and then I went back to Singapore
Okay.
and looking for jobs. And I was actually I wasn't even looking for journalism jobs. I was just looking for video production jobs. So I was applying to TV stations, to like HBO Asia,
Hmm.
and I just happened to apply to this documentary company, like this really small documentary company, who were hiring a production assistant, and I applied because I was like, it's video production work. Um, but because they were doing documentaries for Al Jazeera English, so they were like an independent company who were being commissioned to do documentaries for Al Jazeera English. So actually, it was a lot closer to journalism
Hmm.
than I had, really thought about. And my bosses were journalists. It was two of them. It was such a small company. It was actually two of them plus me, and
Okay.
so that was fun. That was like it was a nice way to kind of crossover, I guess, from what I was learning as what I had learned as a student in film school to journalism. And at the same time, I was also volunteering for this citizen journalism site called the Online Citizen in Singapore, which
Mhm.
um, by now it's the longest running independent news site in Singapore.
Okay.
And so I was doing stuff for them, like little short videos, but also going out and interviewing homeless people, going out and talking to
Okay.
people. So that was like a nice like learning on the job sort of experience. So I
Mhm.
worked in that documentary company for 2 years, and then after that, yeah, I am actually going to jump from video to print and freelance myself. Yeah,
Mhm.
so I've been doing that since.
Yes. So what are some of the topics that you first started covering when you first started journalism compared to like now?
Um, so with the documentary company, we covered Asia a lot. So it wasn't just Singapore. We would like fly around a lot. So we've covered, we did cover the death penalty in Singapore, but we also did like shrimp farming in Bangladesh, dowry violence in Bangladesh,
Mm-hmm.
like the training of Chinese athletes in China,
Okay.
hot housing students in Hong Kong. So we did a lot of stuff around the region. With the Online Citizen, it was all Singapore. We did stories on homelessness, death penalty, and
Mm-hmm.
basically we were trying to do things that the local mainstream media just wouldn't cover or wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
cover well. And that's still what the Online Citizen does. So that's how I kind of got my introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of it was basically learning by doing. And so even now, I generally gravitate towards those sorts of topics: social justice topics, human rights,
Mhm.
politics, these stuff.
So I was just wondering, in terms of fake news, I was, looking at your Twitter and things like that, and I saw you had retweeted one about fake news in Singapore. So I was just wondering, as a journalist, how do you like identify what would you consider as fake news and what you would consider as real news? And I know that here in America, with our new president and everything, we have a lot of issues around like fake news as well. So I was just wondering, like, what is your perspective of it and things like that?
Yeah, so the government has completely jumped on this whole fake news thing to justify
Mm-hmm.
more powers for themselves. And that's exactly what's happened late last night. So late last night, Parliament passed a bill called the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Bill, which is
Mm-hmm.
essentially a fake news law. It's ostensibly to fight fake news, but um, it's really problematic because it gives the government a lot of power. So they introduced it last month and they've passed it this month. So it's been really fast, and we
Yeah.
basically spent like the whole month talking about why this is a bad idea. But the
Mm-hmm.
government, well, the People's Action Party has been in power since 1959 in Singapore. We've never had a change in governments technically.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have the supermajority in parliament. So no matter what we said, they could push it through, and they did last night. So this law gives government ministers, any government minister, the power to demand correction notices, takedowns, or blocking access to content online. So if they feel that something you wrote is false or misleading,
Mm-hmm.
and that it would be in the public interest for them to do something about it, they could make you, put up a notice on your article or your blog post or your Facebook post that says, the government says this is inaccurate. You should go to this website to see what the government
Mm-hmm.
says. Or they could
So,
tell you to take it down. So it's really problematic because it gives them so much power to kind of intervene and essentially probably even censor what's said
yeah.
online.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience is that these sorts of things can be abused for like party, the
Mm-hmm.
party. And from what we see, it's not like the party is above spreading misleading information themselves.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we have seen historically the party spread news of misleading information. So my worry is that a law like that would allow them to control the narrative even more than they do. I mean, they really do to a huge extent, and this is just giving them even more power over what's said
Mm-hmm.
online, which is like the one little space that Singaporeans have to talk a bit more freely, because our mainstream media doesn't really reflect
Mm-hmm.
the political opinions that we have.
So in Singapore, is there any types of like laws or anything like that that, is for freedom of speech or protects against censorship and things like that?
Well, our constitution says that we have freedom of expression, but it
Mm-hmm.
also says subject to laws that we have.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of laws that curb freedom of expression in the interest
Mm-hmm.
of racial harmony, national security, public interest. So, so essentially, I don't know that we can put that much stock by the Constitution that promises us freedom of expression. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's essentially practically subordinate to all these other laws that curb freedom of expression.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just taking some notes here. Okay. So I know that you mentioned in one of your pieces that um, well, when I was reading about you, that you wrote for different type of like newspapers, like the New York Times, Washington, Asian Times, and things like that. So I was just wondering, like, as a journalist, when you write for different newspapers, How exactly does it work?
Um, it's kind of, I guess it I've had to like develop a sense of what I think various papers might be interested in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I tend to write more like, so New York Times, Washington Post, so far have been kind of one-offs for me. I've not pitched them very much. I mean, the New York Times doesn't hire freelancers super often that I know of. Um, I tend to write more for the Asia regional publications because, so like as a Singaporean freelance journalist, I learned very quickly that the international media is not that interested in Singapore. Um,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the things that happen to us, uh, they don't see as super interesting, super important because Singapore is small and far away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's why I write for the Asian publications where they are more likely to see something going on in Singapore as relevant, and they're more likely to cover Singapore in the first place in depth. Um, so that's usually what it is, like different, looking at different publications and trying to get a sense of what it is that they would be interested in. So, so for example, the piece that I wrote for Washington Post was a commentary on fake news from a year ago when the government was still talking about maybe bringing in laws.
Mm-hmm.
And you could kind of get a sense that, like, yeah, if we talk about fake news, that's the thing that American publications are now interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's usually like that, trying to figure out who would be interested in what. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's something I find really interesting because I was talking to some friends about whether they've heard anything about Singapore in the US news because I had studied in South Korea last year. And I
Mm-hmm.
know that, the North Korea and American summit in Singapore was really a really, really big thing in Korea, in
Yeah.
Asia when I traveled in Asia. But when I had asked my friends here if they heard anything about Singapore, they don't even remember that, we had one of the summits in Singapore. So I thought that was like super crazy. And, I feel like American news, we just focus, America is so big that we just
Mm.
focus so much on what's happening here that, we tend to not see what's going on around in the world. So, that's really
Yeah.
interesting that you point that out.
I mean, there is a tendency in the English language media,
Mm-hmm.
to center American experiences and American concerns. So it is like, a lot of us, particularly journalists who follow international news, who have heard a lot about the US, but not the other way around. People wouldn't have heard
Mm-hmm.
about that we cover. It's the same, like, and I feel like that sometimes translates into American struggles being taken more seriously than elsewhere. So we are more likely to have international journalists in solidarity with American journalists for press freedom issues rather than the
Mm-hmm.
other way around. So sometimes, like issues with press freedom in Singapore, uh, when I talk about it to other journalists, international correspondents, it gets a bit dismissed sometimes. They don't really think about it or see it, or they'll tell me, oh, I work somewhere else that's way worse. And it's like, no, I'm not telling you that we are the worst. I'm telling you that,
Yeah,
um,
there's a problem too.
and yeah, so even like with this fake news bill, before it was passed, we had a journalist open letter that we were trying to get people to sign, and that it
Mm-hmm.
was actually a lot harder to get journalists to sign an open letter about press freedom than I thought it would be. A lot of these bureaus have very strict policies about their journalists not signing or expressing a public opinion. And I
Mm-hmm.
completely understand why they have that policy, but when it comes to press freedom, I think you should do something. Um, but then we had journalists who were like, no, 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 it's my personal policy to not sign because this is a story that I might cover.
Mm-hmm.
It's very frustrating because it's not a story, it's an actual law that's going to pass and
Yeah.
actual people, and it's going to affect press freedom. And like, if it does
Mm-hmm.
affect press freedom, what story are you going to cover? And
Mm-hmm.
it's been quite difficult like that. Whereas I find that
Yeah.
when American journalists talk about Trump's press freedom attacks in America, none of us tell them, "Oh, this is just a story. How interesting! We are gonna cover
Mm-hmm.
it." thing about it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. So I remember when I was reading a little bit more about you, I remember one of the articles saying that, a lot of journalists, they tend to have a little bit of like bias in their writing, and it's difficult to kind of stay away from that. So how would you say that, for your own work, how do you stay away from like bias?
So, when journalists debate over objectivity and whether it's a thing, I come down in the school of I don't think objectivity is really possible, because I think every journalist has their backstory, their point of view, their perspective,
Mm-hmm.
the way we see things, the way we choose who to quote or who to talk to. It's all colored by our own experiences. So I
Mm-hmm.
tend to come down in on the side of, if I can't be like super objective, and I know that I can do as much as I can to be fair and balanced and professional,
Mm-hmm.
but I can't completely eliminate bias, then it's best that I'm transparent about who I am and where I am. So um, I kind of straddle the line in Singapore between journalism and civil society activism.
Mm-hmm.
So where relevant and important, I try to make sure people know about that.
Mm-hmm.
So if I write about issues that I've worked on directly, I try to um, work it into the story that I was involved somehow, or like add
Mm-hmm.
an author's note at the bottom that
Okay.
that, or at the very least, I tell my editor what I've done, and then let them decide how much they want to put that in the story or how much they think it's okay. Some
Oh,
editors think it's completely fine and it doesn't bother
mhm.
them. The editors, they let me put a note or something. So we try to be I would prefer to be transparent about that, because
Mhm.
I know I can't like fully eliminate bias.
Yeah. Okay. And my next question for you is regarding your view and your work around the death penalty in Singapore, because I did a little bit of research about the death penalty here in the United States, and realized that it's a very, very controversial and very complex issue, especially because we have like different states and federal laws, state laws, and things like that. So I was just wondering how that death penalty is in Singapore.
Mhm. So the government is very committed to having the death penalty in Singapore, or at
Mm-hmm.
least how they are. Um, and we are still actively executing. In fact, we've seen over the past couple of years executions increase. So
Mm-hmm.
last year we hanged, I think, 13 people. Um, I have a check that, but I think it was 13, because I think we had estimated 9, but when the government came out with the news, it was 13. That's, yeah, if I remember rightly.
Mm-hmm.
So executions are increasing. We will see if it continues to increase this year, but we mostly hang people for drug.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's one of the issues that the UN has always criticized, that the UN pushes for a moratorium on the death penalty, but without a moratorium, at least only use it for heinous crimes. But the drug offenses don't count as heinous crimes, but Singapore uses it for the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really hard actually to know that much about the death penalty, because um, things that happen on death row, the the wardens, the counselors who go in and work with death row inmates, they are all bound by the Official Secrets Act to not speak. So the executioner is also bound by the Official Secrets Act to not speak. So we don't get a lot of information about
Mm-hmm.
what the process of execution is like, how many people are exactly on death row, what happens.
Mm-hmm.
We get what information we can from the death row inmates. Um, we can get quite a lot from them, but there's a limit to how you can verify what they are saying, especially
Mm-hmm.
when the execution. So the government doesn't announce when they're going to do an execution either.
Mm-hmm.
So unless a family of a death row inmate tells us, an execution could happen and we wouldn't know. Like people, Singaporeans just wouldn't know. The government doesn't tell them. So we have to
Crazy.
get what information that we can. And it's really difficult because sometimes the families tell us, but
Mm-hmm.
there's no way to verify it. Or sometimes they tell us and they only know the nickname of the inmate, and there's no way to figure out who that actually is, um,
Hmm.
because we don't know them. So yeah, so it's really difficult to document. We try what we can, but it's very patchy.
Mm-hmm. And what is the general like Singaporean citizens like their view on death rows and the death penalty?
So there is overwhelming support for the death penalty, I would say. In theory, if you ask a Singaporean, do you support the death penalty? I think surveys have shown that about 70 to 80% of them will say yes. Um,
Wow.
Another survey, but the only comprehensive, rigorous study of public opinion on the death penalty found that, so many people will say that they support the death penalty, but if you ask them how much do you know about the death penalty and how few of them know much.
Mm-hmm.
And so that when you introduce more details, when you introduce more information about how the death penalty operates in Singapore and what our laws are and how we use it, um, the support drops. So like it doesn't. Um, a lot of the times it drops to still be over 50%, but it actually starts to waver. So it's to say that 70-80% of Singaporeans want the death penalty in Singapore
Mm-hmm.
as it is not is a little bit of a simplification. It's true that
Mm-hmm.
majority of the people are pro death penalty, but when they hear about how it's done in Singapore, they tend to waver a little bit.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a really complex thing that we don't discuss enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And jumping back to the whole like fake news, do a lot of like Singaporeans technically typically tend to pay a lot of like attention to the news as well? Like what are their stance on like fake news?
Um, we don't have surveys that I take seriously about this. So we have a government survey that said
Mm-hmm.
something like 98% of Singaporeans want something done about fake news. But I have problems with the methodology of that survey. I don't think,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't, it's not even clear that survey defined to somebody what fake news is. So, like,
Mm-hmm.
when people say, yes, I encounter fake news and I don't like it, um, are they talking about misinformation like stuff that we've seen in India that could actually incite hatred, or are they talking
Mm-hmm.
about misinformation like your auntie sending you a message about how drinking cold water gives you cancer? So
Mm-hmm.
this huge range. um so it's really hard to say because the Singapore media landscape is such that the mainstream media is very influenced or even controlled by the government.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if the government wants something to be a problem, if they want you to think that something is a problem, it is possible to arrange stories in the media that would make you think it's a problem. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, while we were talking about fake news, suddenly there were like series of stories coming out in the mainstream media newspapers about how, oh, this is a hoax, oh, this is fake, oh,
Mm-hmm.
oh, we did this policy survey that shows that fake news is a worrying thing in Singapore. And so it's possible to prime people through the mainstream media. Um, and then it's hard to tell, like, did people think that it was a problem before, or did they think it was a problem because we
Mm-hmm.
essentially put it in their minds that it was a problem?
Yes.
Yeah, so like we had that government survey where they're like, overwhelming majority of Singaporeans are worried about fake news, and it's like, yeah, you make them worried, and then you ask them, are you worried?
So is there any like system at all in Singapore where it helps like filter the different news sources and things to see like what's more reliable and what's really not?
Not at the moment. So there's no
Mm-hmm.
like serious national respected fact checking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's yeah, it's tough because our political reality is such that we have this one, practically, essentially, a almost a one party state, and
Mm-hmm.
so a lot of things, there's a lot of self censorship and things like that. It can be quite hard sometimes to pass news, and I think media literacy is definitely something that we need to teach better, but also we need media literacy with political education because for people to really get it, I think they really need to understand the political reality of Singapore. So, like, you know, journalists and activists and researchers, even like embassy staff that I've met, don't take the local mainstream media at face value, even though they're the traditional media, they're the legacy media in Singapore. They should be the reliable, considered the reliable sources.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we don't take the mainstream media at face value in Singapore. In fact, there have been people who've told me, and these are people who are like diplomats, researchers, academics, who are like, yeah, I read the Straits Times, which is the only daily news broadsheet that we have in English. There's only like
Mm-hmm.
one. Yeah, we read the Straits Times to see what they don't say rather than what they do say. So you have to develop this habit of reading between the lines sometimes when you read the mainstream media. So you're
Mm-hmm.
looking out for how they say things, what they do say and what they don't say. Which I think if you're a Singaporean who's not following politics and who, doesn't keep a close eye on this, you might just take it at face value and read it for what it says.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's a difficulty. How do we teach people media literacy in an
Mm-hmm.
environment where their news diet is very confined and dominated by this one government that's able to one
Mm-hmm.
political party rather than that's able to influence the narrative in a big way. Now that there's the internet, I think a lot of young Singaporeans are getting a bit more savvy because they're so used to
Mm-hmm.
having multiple sources of everything on Facebook.
Yeah.
Some of them are getting more savvy, but not all of them. So we need to teach.
Mm-hmm. I would definitely agree with that. So, I was also wondering, like what kind of perspectives does like Singaporeans have on the US media? Like what kind of topics are covered about the US in Singapore?
Hmm. Um, I'm not entirely sure what's covered about the U.S. in
Mm-hmm.
Singapore. Because I don't follow uh, foreign coverage in Singapore media very much because
Mm-hmm.
'cause we can read U.S. media for that. So
Yeah.
Singaporeans I know would not like they wouldn't pick up the Straits Times in Singapore to read about the U.S. They would like
Yeah.
probably read, like New York Times and Washington Post and all that. Um,
Okay.
some Singaporeans have subscriptions to the New York Times and Washington Post to read
Mm-hmm.
online. Uh, so I think generally, though, my impression is that the coverage is not terrible. I don't know how comprehensive it is. I think they would tend to pick up, they have like one US correspondent for the Straits Times in DC, and then they pick up a lot of
Mm-hmm.
stuff from the wire. So it's really the same that you could read anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Yeah, so I think that's very US media. I mean, some Singaporeans they will point to it and be like, look at this, it's a mess, all the ownership problem. But they had to use that to like justify why we don't have press freedom in Singapore. So I don't know how
Mm-hmm.
seriously to take those sorts of things. But people do like they do read, and Singaporeans especially like to read foreign media coverage of Singapore because sometimes you read it for curiosity to see if they're gonna screw it up, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people do. But um, there's also curiosity of what foreign media writes about Singapore, because there's a sense that foreign media can tell us things that our local media will not tell us,
Mm-hmm.
and that they can report more honestly because these foreign journalists are not as afraid, which is not always true, but yeah, you can see more critical reports in the foreign media. So I do see
Mm-hmm.
Singaporeans online, particularly sharing like articles about Singapore from
Mm-hmm.
The Guardian, from the New York Times, from LA
Yeah.
Times. Yeah.
Do you think that this question is a little bit off
Mhm.
topic, but on the topic of Singapore, the new I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Crazy Rich Asians, have that played a part at all in how like media covers Singapore like internationally, things like that?
Um, I don't think Crazy Rich Asians created it, but it completely played into the image that Singapore is this shiny, rich
Mm-hmm.
playground. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a sort of stereotype that people have about Singapore. We're this
Yeah.
rich playground. That's a little
Uh-huh.
bit odd. We don't let you chew gum. Um, and that's kind of about as deep as people's understanding of Singapore goes,
Yeah.
which is a problem, because then a lot of these issues that we have are not taken very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And the government and the PAP government knows how to play that, because they use more subtle forms of repressive action that doesn't challenge the stereotype very much.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're not going to see, it's very unlikely that we would see mass arrests and like
Mm-hmm.
people disappearing like in China. But small, like, prosecutions of one activist here, prosecution of one activist there, it gets reported, but it's not taken super seriously, because on the whole Singapore looks like everything is working and everything is nice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that builds a much more enduring system, I think, of
Mm-hmm.
authoritarian control than really overt forms of. And I think, you know, other governments are kind of figuring that out and doing similar things. And, all around the world, other countries are picking more subtle ways of controlling the media, of clamping down on activists, than just, outright, very overt assassination, kill them, arrest them,
Mm-hmm.
kill them. And so what we see in Singapore, I think, will slowly happen in some other countries as well, which is why sometimes activists in Singapore say, please look at us, because you can get a view of like how some other countries are gonna do it. So like Crazy Rich Asians did not help to surface that conversation.
Yeah.
Although we wouldn't have expected a film like that to surface it. I
Mm-hmm.
think my main problem was I was really like very frustrated by the discussion around Crazy Rich Asians, because it again
Mm-hmm.
showed how little solidarity there was between Americans in other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it was kind of like, well, as one of my friends put it, they're like, oh yeah, Asian Americans are still Americans, and they can't see themselves from the center. Like, so like Crazy Rich Asians was hugely celebrated as like this milestone. It's a movement. Or I went to the cinema and watched it, and I cried so much. And yeah, I can understand why Asian Americans would feel that way about this
Mm-hmm.
film, because representation has been such a problem. But if you talk about representation in Singapore, Crazy Rich Asians completely wiped out our ethnic minorities. Like
Mm-hmm.
Chinese are the majority here, so when we see Crazy Rich
Mm-hmm.
Asians, we are not like, what a breakthrough for representation. We're like, where are the brown Singaporeans?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so what Asian Americans were upset about in US mainstream films, they did to Singaporean minorities
Yeah.
with Crazy Rich Asians, and then like didn't talk about it. And in fact, when I talked about it, they were a lot of Asian Americans were not interested, and they were like,
Mm-hmm.
this is step one, and then like maybe it'll get better in the future. I was like, so step one is you, and then maybe you'll get to the rest of the world. Like that's not how
Yeah.
you really care about representation. And also the way that the Chinese were represented in Singapore is not reflective of what Singapore and China like. So I had a lot of issues with Crazy Rich Asians. Yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting to know. Um, so my very last question for you actually is, as a journalist in general who has covered like many different countries, what advice would you give to American students or just Americans in general, and American journalists, like anything?
I think probably more openness to looking at the context of different places. So like obviously, and like this should be obvious, but sometimes I'm surprised by the number of journalists or expat journalists in Southeast Asia who don't get this, that the US sort of experience and perspective cannot be applied blanket to other countries. We do see things differently. We do have different assumptions and stereotypes and different ways of thinking that would be really good if could take a bit of time to get under the skin. I think a lot of it is privileged because American journalists can travel quite, particularly those who have some particularly those who have the financial ability. Um, they they can travel, they can come to Southeast Asia, and to a lot of American journalists, well, not Singapore, but a lot of other parts of Southeast Asia are very cheap. So it is easy to like up sticks, move to Southeast Asia and be a journalist here. And I think it's important to recognize how much of a privilege that is, and be aware that an American journalist could do that, but a Southeast Asian could never just up sticks and move to the US and be accepted as a journalist and get a visa to stay. Especially if we don't speak the language. Like the number of just like not just American, but Australian, British, white journalists who come to Southeast Asia don't speak the language but get to stay and be taken seriously. Yeah, I mean that's for the most part I don't have a huge problem with it because a lot of very good journalists have come to Southeast Asia, and I've worked with them, and it's great that they're there. But I think one thing to definitely think about is, are you helping to build capacity in that country that you've gone to, or are you just taking up air? So it's in Cambodia and Myanmar, sometimes a lot of the reporting done in English are done by expat journalists because the English language level is not quite there among the local population. Or there are not quite enough skills training and things like that. So I would say that to be aware of, are you helping to build capacity? Are you passing on your knowledge to locals, like local journalism students? Are you helping local reporters? Are you working with them in ways that are collaborative and not exploitative? So are you collaborating with them as equal journalists, or are you just treating them as your translator? Or if they are your fixers, are they actually doing more work than you are? And if so, what is the credit and payment that they should be getting? Things like that, otherwise it's just ending up becoming a very exploitative situation. And so, some of the, I edit a publication that covers Southeast Asia. So we work with freelancers across all this. So we think about this a lot. And, a lot of our best kind of American or, basically expat reporters are reporters who are very, very connected to the ground. They've tried to learn the language the best they can, or they are very committed to, in the long run, practically doing themselves out of a job. So I've spoken. So, for example, our editor in Cambodia is an expat in Cambodia, but he's very keen on making sure that Cambodian writers get to write for us, that they get published, that he teaches in a university. He wants to get his students published. And the goal is to get more and more Cambodians writing in Cambodia, so that when you read about Cambodia, the bio less and less white people's names. And I think that's really important. And
Yes.
really thought about as much as it should be before.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely agree with that. And so, yeah, those are all my questions for you. If you have any questions for me, like feel free to ask.
Oh no,
And yeah, if not, thank you so much for taking the time out of
no.
your day to talk with me. And yeah,
Okay, no problem.
thank you so much. Okay. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Okay.
Thank